All right, let's just dive right into this explainer and unpack the totally fascinating, mostly hidden history of an absolute intellectual powerhouse of classical Athens, Aspasia of Miletus. When we think of the Golden Age of Athens, our minds usually jump straight to those marble statues of men in togas, right? The philosophers, the generals, the politicians. But when you look closely at the historical record, it actually points to a brilliant woman operating right at the very center of this world. She wasn't just a bystander. She was the intellectual companion to Athens' most prominent statesman, Pericles. So to kick things off, we really have to ask this compelling question to set the stage for one of antiquity's greatest intellectual mysteries. Who exactly was this brilliant woman hiding just behind the curtain of Athens' most famous leader? Uncovering Aspasia's story is absolutely crucial because it completely challenges our traditional view of history. It really forces us to ask, how much of the celebrated political and oratorical brilliance of classical Athens was actually shaped by a woman who, legally speaking, wasn't even allowed to be a citizen? Section 1. The Hetaira Loophole, Finding Agency in Athens. Now, to really grasp how Aspasia achieved her incredible level of influence, we have to start by understanding the extremely rigid social structure of the ancient Athenian world, especially when it came to women. Looking at this breakdown of how ancient Greek sources categorized female sex workers, you can see there were basically three main tiers. Down at the bottom were the porne, who were street or brothel workers offering purely physical services. Then you had the palake, who were essentially household concubines. But right at the very top was the Hetaira. Aspasia definitely wasn't a common street worker. She was an elite, highly educated Hetaira. These women were high-status courtesans, and their primary value? It was actually providing conversation, culture, musical performance, and top-tier intellectual companionship to the most powerful men in the city. This is where it gets really fascinating. You'd probably assume that being an Athenian citizen wife was the best gig in town, right? Well, actually, average citizen wives completely lacked legal personhood. They were strictly secluded indoors and needed a male legal guardian called a kurios to do literally anything. But on the flip side, the free, often foreign-born Hetaira found this incredible loophole for independence and agency. They could actually manage their own finances, own property, and enjoy genuine public mobility. By existing outside the traditional family structure, a Hetaira like Aspasia essentially bought her own freedom to participate in society. And all that public participation? Well, it happened at the symposium. Think of the symposium as the ultimate boys' club of ancient Greece, an exclusive, male-only, private drinking party where the elite gathered to debate politics and philosophy. Citizen wives were completely banned from these events. No way were they getting in. Yet, this was the exact arena where highly trained Hetaira were welcomed with open arms as entertainers and guests. They were trained in music, poetry, and crucially, rhetoric and philosophical discourse. It was in these very rooms, over glasses of wine, that women like Aspasia wielded their immense influence. Moving on to Section 2, Aspasia's Arrival, from Miletus to Athens. Let's look at how our protagonist's remarkable life actually builds across the historical record. Following her timeline here, Aspasia was born around 470 BCE in Miletus. That was a super wealthy trading city in modern-day Turkey, famously renowned as a hub for philosophic inquiry. So she leaves Miletus, arrives in Athens sometime before 450 BCE, and then, by about 445 BCE, she pulls off something totally unprecedented. She quickly becomes the partner of Athens' most prominent military and political leader, Pericles, right after he amicably divorces his wife. She stays by his side through the absolute peak of his power and even survives the devastating Athenian plague in 429 BCE. Which brings us to Section 3, Slander and Comic Abuse. Because, as we all know, extreme proximity to power attracts powerful enemies, and Aspasia faced an intense, highly public backlash for her influence. Just look at these wild accusations from the comic poets of her time. I mean, Aristophanes, in his play The Acharnians, essentially blamed Aspasia for single-handedly provoking the massive Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. Cratinas publicly abused her on stage, calling her a shameless prostitute. There are even reports that the comedian Hermippus prosecuted her in court for impiety, allegedly forcing Pericles to literally defend her in tears. What you really need to take away from this is just how deeply threatened the Athenian patriarchy was by her intellect. They were blaming a foreign woman with zero voting rights for major wars and massive political shifts, which, ironically, just confirms the massive scale of her actual political influence. But despite all that public abuse, her influence was so deep, and Pericles' devotion to her was so absolute that it led to one monumental exception.
Now, Pericles himself had previously written this incredibly strict law denying Athenian citizenship to anyone who didn't have two Athenian parents. But after his legitimate son Xanthippus died in the plague, Pericles actually had to go and beg the Athenian democracy for just one single special exception to his very own strict laws. He did the whole shebang just so the son he had with Aspasia, Pericles the Younger, could be recognized as a legitimate Athenian citizen.
All right, Section 4, the intellectual powerhouse. Once we peel back all those layers of comic slander, we discover the incredible reality of her daily life. She ran a truly formidable intellectual salon. Step by step, her home functioned as the ultimate epicenter of Athenian thought. First, she was highly esteemed for instructing the Athenian elite in oratorical composition. Basically, she was teaching powerful men how to speak powerfully. Second, the sources state she was actively engaged in philosophic arguments with Socrates himself. Think about that for a second. And third, she was widely known for advising statesmen, particularly Pericles, on public policy. She wasn't just a party host, she was literally the central intellectual node of classical Athens. And that brings us to this massive, mind-blowing historical question, which is honestly my favorite part of this whole explainer. Did a woman actually write Athens' greatest speeches? Historical accounts heavily suggest she was esteemed for her oratorical skills, and ancient authorities strongly imply she had a heavy hand in Pericles' acclaimed public addresses. We're talking about his world-famous funeral oration of 430 BCE. Did Aspasia write it? Well, check out this detail from Plato's writings, which brilliantly illustrates that possibility. In his dialogue, Menexenus, Plato documents his master, Socrates, reciting a funeral oration and specifically attributing its masterful rhetoric directly to Aspasia's genius. Now, sure, Plato is known to be a bit sarcastic here, kind of implying she composed speeches well for a woman, but the very fact that he places her in this role cemented her memory in the Socratic circle as a total rhetorical powerhouse and the ideal philosophic woman. She was holding her own, on totally equal terms, with the greatest philosophers in history. Finally, Section 5, a lasting feminist legacy. Let's look at how her memory evolved long after the plague and the fall of her era, completely transcending the limits of the ancient world. She transitioned seamlessly through history. By the 4th century BCE, Socrates' own students, like Antisthenes and Aeschines, were writing philosophic dialogues entirely titled Aspasia. She became this rhetorical commonplace, the ultimate idealized figure of an educated woman. Fast forward to the modern era, and she's a prominent symbol of female independence. She was featured heavily in North American feminist movements, most notably taking a literal seat at the table in artist Judy Chicago's famous 1979 multimedia work, The Dinner Party. She proved that a woman could wield incredible, lasting influence even in a deeply, deeply male-dominated society. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. If Athens' greatest statesman was heavily reliant on the genius of a foreign-born companion who had no legal rights of her own, well, who really held the pen when our history was written? It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other marginalized voices have completely shaped our world from the shadows, just waiting for us to uncover their stories?